And that jarring cacophony tells you you're back listening to the Power of Three podcast. We're the Doctor Who podcast that comes from Scotland. We like to look at the show in all its forms. I'm Kenny Smith, and today we are going to be discussing a new book on Doctor Who and the Avengers scriptwriter Malcolm Hulke. We are going to be speaking shortly with the man who's written this book, Michael Herbert. He previously wrote Doctor Who and the Communist, and now he has done a biography of Malcolm Hulke as well. This new publication is called Things Are Not Always What They Seem, The Writing and Politics of Malcolm Hulke. So, before we begin, let's have a quick overview. Of course, Malcolm Hulke, known as Mac to his friends, has been back in the spotlight recently, given that there was the documentary all about him on the Season 7 Blu-ray. And one of the people who contributed to this was indeed Michael Herbert. But now we're going to have a quick overview as to what this book is about, and just who Mac was. Universally known as Mac's comrades, colleagues and friends, Malcolm Hulke was a successful writer for radio, television and cinema from the 1950s to the late 1970s. His work included episodes for Armchair Theatre and The Avengers, and 54 episodes for Doctor Who, broadcast between 1967 and 1974, for which he is, of course, best remembered. Alongside Terence Dicks, he co-created the concept of the Time Lords and offered viewers their first glimpse of Gallifrey in the War Games, and created the Reptilian Silurians, their cousins the Sea Devils, and of course the Draconians. He wrote the novelisations of every story he had written solo, and several he worked on with other writers for Target Books. He also wrote a Doctor Who radio pilot, Journey into Time, which starred Peter Cushing, sadly lost to the mists of time. It was recorded but never broadcast. He also did a fondly remembered guide for television writers on the making of Doctor Who with Terence Dicks, and edited a writer's guide in 1969 and 1970 on writing for television, produced for the Television and Screenwriters Guild. Of course, Mac was also a socialist, belonging for a time to the Communist Party of Great Britain, and his political views fed into his work. The Morning Star notes that MI5, who monitored him by steaming open his mail, bugging his phone and the phones of places he worked or organisations he belonged to, once described him as a dangerous man and without scruples so far as his communistic outlook is concerned. The writer Michael Herbert has previously documented Mac's work, as mentioned, in Doctor Who and the Communist, which was published by Five Leaves Press in 2015, and in an extensive and informative post on his Fantasies of Possibility blog, But Things Are Not Always What They Seem, is a more extensive examination of both the writing and politics of the influential creator. Michael, who's been watching Doctor Who since 1963, is a socialist historian who lives in Tameside, Greater Manchester, whose work includes books on the history of radical women in the 19th and 20th century. He teaches history to adults at Aquinas College, Stockport, and Chetham's Library in Manchester. His published work includes Never Counted Out, the story of Len Johnson, Manchester's black boxing hero and communist, The Wearing of the Green, a political history of the Irish in Manchester, and Up Then Brave Women, Manchester's Radical Women, 1819 to 1918. He is also a trustee of the Working Class Movement Library in Salford and a committee member of the Mary Quayle Club. So, we've talked enough about the book, we've talked enough about Michael. Let's meet the man who has brought the story and the life of Malcolm Hulke together.
My name is Michael Herbert, and I've just completed and published a biography of Malcolm Hulke, the writer, a scriptwriter who wrote for many series in the 60s, many classic series and drama, and probably the world's most well-known for Doctor Who, but that by no means defined his career, to put it mildly.
Most definitely not, as anybody who's watched the documentary and the Blu-ray will know. So when did you first develop an interest in Mac?
Yeah, so I've been a Doctor Who fan since, November, to show my age here, Kenny, November 1963, when I was 8 1/4. And a quarter is very important when you're 8.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So I started watching it then and kind of watched it, ever since, really. Well, up until recently anyway, but maybe we don't want to talk about that today. But I was a huge fan in the 60s and 70s and watched it constantly because it was on all the time, and people forget how often Doctor Who was on, which was all the time, really, every Saturday after Grandstand and before Jukebox Jury. So it was, once you had one episode, then you only had 6 days to wait for the next one, and so you got to know the characters and the actors and the storylines very well. So over the years, I became a sort of involved in socialist politics in the late 70s with Rock Against Racism and Anti-Nazi League and combating the National Front. And then sort of got to know Ruth and Eddie Frau, 2 members of the Communist Party. Well, members until they were thrown out in the 90s, but again, we'll skip over that. But they founded a thing called the Working Class Movement Library initially in their own home in Trafford, and then it moved in 87, I think it was, to a huge old nurses' home on the Crescent in Salford. And I was quite involved as a sort of supporter and then a trustee. And when Doctor Who returned, I got into 05, I got quite interested in the history. And then I came across the name of Malcolm Hulke somewhere, and some people were saying he was in the Communist Party. So I thought, well, let's have a look in the records, because they had a lot of Communist Party stuff. I didn't find anything there, but I did find a pamphlet that Malcolm wrote towards the end of the 1950s for Unity Theatre. The Unity Theatre was a socialist theatre group founded in the 30s. Based in London, Goldington Street, not far from King's Cross, I think, and put on a huge number of productions and involved ordinary people as actors, as lighting engineers, and in all sorts of ways in the theatre. And Malcolm was involved in as a production manager. And then he wrote a pamphlet about the Unity Theatre explaining how the company worked, really, called Here is Drama. And it's kind of aimed at people who've just joined Unity but are wandering around wondering, what's a producer? What's an ASM? How can I get involved? How can I get my viewpoint across? So it's one of the first things he wrote. So I came across that and I started to research a bit and then wrote a blog post. And then I was contacted by Five Leaves Press, by Ross Bradshaw, who runs Five Leaves Bookshop in Nottingham. And he wanted to publish it as a small pamphlet. So I revised it. And then I heard that someone else was writing a biography of Malcolm, so I thought, well, there's no point in pursuing it any further because I'm quite busy and they'll probably do a better job. But that never came out. And then, fast forwarding 5 years, COVID came along and we're all stuck at home for several months on end. So I thought I might have another go at trying to find out more about him. So I started to look through all the newspapers I could find online. Luckily, with one of the things that was wonderful now compared to when I used to research in the 90s is the internet and access to newspapers. So the British Newspaper Archive has vast amounts of newspapers going back to the 18th, 19th century. And I found a lot of references to Mac in the stage, reviews of his TV work. So I started to kind of construct a timeline, started to construct chapters on various aspects of his life. I was also very lucky because of COVID that I discovered or heard that the National Archives had some MI5 material on Malcolm. So from time to time, and I've no idea why, but it's very useful for historians, MI5 releases files on obviously people who passed away into the National Archives, which you can access. So luckily they had a file on him from about 1948 through to 63. And due to COVID, I didn't have to go to London to look at it. They were prepared, in return for hard cash, to send it to me. And so I got these 3 huge envelopes of material on Malcolm. Because he was in the Communist Party, joined about 1944, 45, I think. So they kept tabs on anybody, no matter how small a role they played in the party, which in Malcolm's case was quite small, really. But nevertheless, he worked briefly for the party for about 2 weeks. So there was transcripts of letters he'd written to people and replies, transcripts of material from the Communist Party, telephone call. So anytime he phoned up or if someone phoned him, there would be a transcript. And also MI5 had a bug within the Communist Party headquarters at 16 King Street. So anytime someone was in a room where the bug was, that was transcribed. And then they would very carefully look through all the names of the people mentioned and then they would assign them all to different files. So there's a couple of hundred files on Malcolm, which is very useful for a historian, to have verbatim copies of phone calls and verbatim copies of his letters.
That's amazing.
I know. Another great leap forward in that, because for a long time I wasn't really finding out a huge amount about it, but then I managed to make contact with Jean Tate. And Jean was the daughter of Malcolm's landlady, Betty Tate. She was in the party as well. And he started lodging with Betty in Hampstead at 45 Parliament Hill in 1955 and stayed there till he died in 79. And Jean, who was a teenager in the 50s, sort of was very interested in Malcolm. Said he wasn't like anybody she'd ever met. You know, he kind of talked to her as an equal. He was full of ideas and they would discuss politics and all sorts of other things. So they became good friends. And Malcolm took Jean and Malcolm's niece Julia on a trip to Yugoslavia, which is a place that hardly anybody went to in the 60s. And they went to a film festival at Pula because Malcolm had written drama for Yugoslavian TV, unsurprisingly. Though Jean had strong memories of Malcolm and their conversations, but also 40 letters that Malcolm had written to her when she was working in Nigeria between 74, I think it was, and 76. He wrote to her almost every week. Those kind of old, the blue aerograms that people our age can remember. Mm-hmm. So again, there are fascinating insights into what he was doing, his ups and downs, you know, struggling for money, struggling for work. So they're kind of fascinating insight into his life at the time. And also managed to make contact with a few other people who remembered Malcolm from the 70s because they'd been sort of teenagers. And again, a bit like Jean, they found him very sort of interesting and he was kind of kind to them. And also then there was people who'd met him not that long before he died, when the sort of wonderful world of Doctor Who fandom arrived in the 70s, with people producing fanzines and fan newsletters, for which there were hundreds at one point. Some of them made their way to Hampstead to interview him, so those were available. And finally, Gary Hopkins, who another fan from South Wales, went to meet Mac in March 79. I interviewed him, and that tape has survived and is featured briefly in the recent documentary about Malcolm that's, as you mentioned, it's on the Blu-ray. So those are all different sources of material. So from that, I was able to construct, with the additional material from the newspapers, you know, reasonably, I think, a coherent account of his work and his kind of political sort of aspirations. I mean, not a life as such, because I think a life of a person is impossible, really. But I think it's focusing on his writing and the importance that he saw of writing being valued. And properly paid too. Let's not forget that. So that's why I got involved in the late 50s with setting up the Writers Guild, which brought together people like Ted Willis, who'd been in the Communist Party as well, Eric Pace, that Malcolm worked with in the late 50s, David Whittaker, and Zita Dundas, and a number of others. And they campaigned to get the BBC and the new ITV companies to start paying the writers a better pay rate. I mean, the slogan or the motto of the Writers Guild to begin with was, taking it from the Bible, in the beginning was the Word. In other words, without a script, you're all sitting around in your studio looking at each other.
I love that. It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing how that's been triggered off by finding out that he was he was a member of the Communist Party, and it's taken arms and legs, and it's not even done a marathon. It's probably done like a trip halfway around the world from the sounds of things. It's incredible. I mean, I think for people of my generation in fandom, I sort of started watching the show in the mid to late 70s. And he's a name that we recognise from Target novelisations and those days that we couldn't see. And his novelisations were different. There was something in there. There were just extra human touches and showing the human frailty and condition in that. And I think that's what really made him stand out to me as being somebody to take a note of. And then, of course, when you get involved in fandom, you discover later on that he passed away, and you think, oh, that's such a shame, because there's still so much more to give.
It was before really sort of fandom was really, the conventions and the endless sort of, and anybody so much worked as a cleaner on a Doctor Who set has been interviewed endlessly. But he sort of died before that all came along, really. There was just a few interviews in magazines and that one recorded interview. So there's nothing on TV, nothing on radio, really. I've got a script of something he wrote for radio in '63 about his upbringing, about how he never went to school. His mother was moving around so much, evading creditors mostly. So they were changing addresses all the time, almost like weekly, I think. So he never actually went to a school. So he was kind of taught by his mother and various au pairs, I think. He spent a lot of time with adults, so he never had a childhood as such. And then he sort of, in the mid-50s, decided he wanted to write. But it's a shame that he wasn't around to have ever been interviewed on video, but that just doesn't exist. But you were right about the Target books, because again, this is hard for younger people to remember, that there were no repeats. So Doctor Who was on, and then it was gone. And even the BBC didn't bother keeping half of the broadcast episodes. So when the Target novels came along in '74, I think it was, they were almost like a kind of VHS or Betamax release, weren't they? But as you say, as he says in the interviews, he didn't just wheel out a kind of novelization of the script. He kind of revamped and tried to, as he said, you've got a duty to improve it if you think you can. So there's lots of extra touches, as you say. Gives backstories to all sorts of even quite small characters, and also introduces new scenes. I think he revamps how Joe Grant comes into it in the Colony in Space.
Yep.
Introduced, so the whole kind of unit thing is kind of brought into Colony in Space, and her introduction in was it the Autumn Invasion? I think she first
Terror of the Autons, yeah.
Terror of the Autons, yes. That's kind of ditched in favour. So, but they says, well, the novels are coming out years after the TV's gone out, so who will remember? We all know them quite well now because we've watched them endlessly. But you didn't have that in the '70s, so. Yeah. So they are novel. You have to review them as novels in their own tone, even change the names of some of the, and added in, as to say, new characters. Well, there's a whole thing in, let's see, Colony in Space about Dent, the leader of the IMC, and how he's like a company man. He's provided with a company IMC house. He gets an IMC wife, sort of selected from the computer, and they staple their personnel records together. So there's a whole sort of little sort of backstory there for a character who in many ways isn't sympathetic, but he feels well. And also in the one novel, which isn't a novelization of his own work, is The Green Death. And there's a chapter or a section in there as from the perspective of one of the slugs just kind of waking up around the corner from Cho, I think, and feeling very hungry.
It's such a shame, though, when you read this sort of thing, you think his writing career, to the best of my knowledge, really sort of ended on television, at least with Doctor Who in 1974, because it's all these touches. You think these are things that would make great, when I say in inverted commas, normal, straight family or adult dramas, and these are things that the human touches, the foibles, the real life things that make such a difference between taking something that's, and I'm not in any way denigrating soap, but pushing it from a soap opera into a drama series.
One of the things he wrote for, as a kind of like bread and butter from about 68 through to the 74, I think, was Crossroads, which was on all the time. Often derided by the critics, but very popular and needed a huge amount of writing because it's, as I say, there's an episode every day. So he was always writing for them and wrote four novels based on Crossroads in addition to his Doctor Who novels. So as you say, he stopped writing for TV. A lot of the series that he wrote for in the 60s had come to an end, like Danger Man and The Avengers had moved on from its early 60s origins. Well, that was over by 69 anyway. And many other series had sort of ended, and Doctor Who had changed hands, had new producer, new script editor, and whatever reason, they didn't ever ask him to write anything, whether they wanted new writers or their own writers, which is often the case when a new team takes over.
He'd have been a great writer for the New Avengers, I always thought.
Yeah, still wasn't asked to write for that either. So But then he was making money from writing and doing the novels, which were very popular. They sold in vast quantities, as did the Crossroads novels. So, which is why there are so many still available. If you go on to second-hand book sites, you'll still find these novels quite reasonably priced because there's so many published. And so he made money out of that. He wrote The Making of Doctor Who with Terrance Dicks, of course, which the first one was in 72 that Malcolm wrote. And then the 76 version is one that Terrance wrote. So again, in a sort of before mass fandom, that was the first time anyone had ever explained, really, for people who didn't remember, or there's no reason why they would know, how Doctor Who actually started. Because obviously in 53 just appeared on the screen. So he delved into its kind of construction by Sidney Newman and Donald Wilson and others in the sort of spring of 63. And he was asked to write for it quite early on. Put forward two ideas, one about the Romans leaving Britain, another one about a planet that was like a mimic of the Earth. And they kind of were quite interested, and they were scheduled, but then they weren't used. I think they kind of moved on to more like, we need the new Daleks.
Yeah, finding the monster of the week.
Yeah, you need something that they sort of go through a whole variety of different sort of things, which might be the new Daleks, like the mechanoids, well, they didn't really take over, the war machines, the annoying quarks. So their big success obviously was the one that Kit Pedler and Jerry Davies came up with, a Cybermen, which is a kind of brilliant concept, I think, of for how human beings can be eventually. You replace everything in a person. What have you got left? Is it still human, or is it actually something else, something new?
Yeah, of course, Mac also did effectively the definitive guide for writing for TV in Britain as well.
Yes, yeah, that came out in the mid-70s. They kind of pours into, it's got a huge amount in it. Pours into all this lot of knowledge accumulated since the sort of mid-50s, over 20 years, of how you actually write for television. I think this is one of his driving forces, is to explain to people about, starting with that Unity pamphlet that I mentioned, Here is Drama, The Making of Doctor Who, and then the writing for television, which is, you could, even if you knew nothing about television. I mean, Andrew Carmel says that when he started as script editor, that he had it, next to him as a kind of guide on how you go about. So it was still relevant then, less so now, obviously, because TV's changed so much. But the sheer complexity of how they produce television, in some sense, I think maybe it's a bit of a relief, perhaps, for him to then just be writing novels, because with a novel, you kind of write it, tapping away at your home, take it to publishers, hopefully they like it, and then it's published. There aren't endless revisions, or it hasn't gone the whole rounds of producers saying, "Oh, we can't afford this. Can you change that character?" I mean, in the first version of The Making of Doctor Who, explains how the Sea Devils came into being, and that took about a year from the first idea to the final broadcast. Whereas with novels, they just kind of go out, and then they're saying, "When can you write the next one?" I should say that I think the writing for television was very successful, unlike some of his other things. So he did a book about MPs, the Parliamentary Directory, what they did, who they were, what the clubs they belonged to, their interests, which sort of sold hardly anything. Because I think MPs, public then and now, aren't that interested in their MPs, really. They just want to do things for them. And he did a guide to alternative medicine. And he wrote a little novel, Roger Moore and the Crime Fighters.
I remember that. I had that because I was a big Roger Moore Bond fan.
So it was a part of a series, or 6 of them, I think. He wrote the first one, in which kind of it's about sort of children, young people getting involved in adventures, and they're being advised by Roger Moore. So I think some of the money from the books went to a Roger Moore Foundation or something.
Which is good to know. Went to a good charitable purpose. And I'd imagine that, when you've got all this information, as a former journalist, I know how difficult that can be when I've got 5 voices that I need to condense into, for example, a 600 words length story, and everybody's got an important part to add. So with what you had, and obviously, as you said, it started the research during the pandemic, this must have been, in some ways, a labour of love, but also a bit of a killer as well, given that you've got so much information, and what you include, what you leave out, and in terms of structure as well.
Yeah, I didn't leave out that much, actually.
That's good.
That's why it's,
lucky you.
Yeah, I don't have to meet a sort of a deadline by sort of 2 o'clock the next morning. So it's got 452 pages, so that counts. There was a lot of words in it. So I divided it into 10 chapters, looking at his sort of how he was brought up, and then his involvement with the CP, Communist Party, the Unity Theatre. And I kind of split it into looking at his sort of work from 58 to 63 on television. A couple of chapters on Doctor Who in the 60s and then the 70s. One just on the Avengers. One about, and this is a sort of unknown episode. He was asked by the Trade Union Congress. They were celebrating the 100 years in 1968. They've been founded in 1868 in Manchester, I think. So they're having a big celebration in Manchester in 1968 at Bellevue. And he was asked to write a kind of script for a pageant, which he worked on with Jerry Davis.
Wow.
And so they came up with something which they sent to them, and they hated it. And they were sacked from it.
Oh, no.
And then he spent about 2 years chasing the TUC, run by Vic Feather, who you and I remember possibly. I certainly do.
Yeah.
He just refused to pay him and said, well, you didn't finish what we wanted you to do, so I'm not going to pay you anymore. So his union eventually got quite involved. The Writers Guild, Alan Griffiths, the secretary, went to see Vic Feather eventually and said, look, you need to pay him. And they had quite a shouting match, I think. But eventually Mark did get his fee. So he was quite sort of, if he felt he'd been affronted, he was kind of quite focused on remedying it. And the final chapter, number 10, is about all his novels and his other works, which are called Lift Any Stone and You'll Find a Writer. Because he wrote 2 guides for his own union. He wrote 2 writer's guides in 69 and 70 with a huge amount of information again. He kind of called on everybody he knew, I think. I mean, he wrote some of it, but rounded up sort of articles from dozens of other people he clearly knew from his writing career about how you can make a living out of being a writer. So I think that was, again, it's all part of him sort of saying to people, well, it's a craft, but if you work hard, you might well get somewhere. And these are some pointers on how you might want to do it. In some sense that I'll just give a quick quote. Yeah, did an article on Writer's World. Lift any stone and you'll find a writer. Day or night, someone somewhere is writing a catchy advertising phrase, reducing technical symbols into plain English, preparing an after-dinner speech for someone else to be brilliant with, or desperately trying to plot a third act. There are you journalists chasing fire engines, critics keeping awake in the stalls, documentary writers risking life and limb in coal mines, specialist writers painstakingly interviewing the subjects of their next non-fiction book, and after all that, they will be back to their typewriters to render it all down to something that others will want to read, see, or listen to. So on, and he kind of mentioned how many newspapers there were to write for, which I suspect now is probably a tenth of what there was.
Oh, it is terrifying. I mean, the paper that I was talking about earlier and that I edited, when I left there, the circulation was about 4,500 10 years ago. It's the last ABC figure, I think, was around 268. And that's in a decade, literally a decade it's dropped.
I think if you look at all the national press, the actual printed edition, I mean, the Guardian is down to about 100,000, and yet in the height of the anti-Thatcher years, it was like probably 500,000.
Yeah.
But obviously they've been replaced by many ways by websites. But I still have an affection for a printed newspaper. But
it's just a shame that so many people who are writers call themselves journalists when there's a big difference between being a writer and a journalist.
Yes.
So
I think a lot of those newspapers, sadly, are just rewriting press releases.
Yeah.
And that's it. They haven't got time to do anything else because there's like 2 people in an office servicing, a whole city. That's a bit of an aside. But there's going to be something about the book in the Morning Star, the left-wing newspaper, this coming Saturday. So hopefully that'll help boost sales a bit.
Absolutely. So talking of sales and getting a copy of the book, where can people obtain it?
Right. So it's available on a website called lulu.com. So I've self-published it because once I finished it, I wanted to get it out really. And luckily, I had a friend who was a sort of designer. So he designed the front cover and did a very brilliant job of that. And then sort of sorted out all the text and put in all the pictures and everything else. And Martin worked very hard on it. Recommend Martin's podcast, by the way, Vision on Sound, where he talks about classic television. It's on every Sunday on All FM in Manchester. Yeah, so I published it up myself with Martin's enormous help. And so if people go to lulu.com and stick in Malcolm Hulke or Michael Herbert, they should find they've got two books on there. an anthology of the work of the Manchester Guardian journalist Madeleine Linford that I did last year, and then my new one, Things Are Not Always What They Seem, which I'm sure you know, Kenny, is from The Faceless Ones.
Very much so. It's hiding in plain sight.
Yes.
Oh, it's a wonderful story, The Faceless Ones. I was so glad when I got the animation treatment and to enjoy it in a completely different way. And the fact that the original words are still all there, just the visuals are different, but it's still wonderfully done.
It's kind of an example of how the Doctor often starts out right on the fringes, and he arrives somewhere, nobody knows who they are, they're very hostile, it's often locked up, or nobody's listening to him. And then gradually he starts to sort of work his way to the centre, because people say, well, what he's saying is true. And so by the fourth episode or whatever, he's in control and everyone's doing what he wants.
And it's no surprise when you see Mac's name on it, given how Avengers it feels, sort of like taking the ordinary and making it into the extraordinary with package holiday tours, which were, of course, just growing. And God knows what he'd have made of Club 1830, but there we go.
If you look at his work on the Avengers, which we could talk about for hours, he sort of took often ordinary, if not mundane, businesses are covers for nefarious goings on. So in The Mauritius Penny, which he co-wrote with Terence Dix,
of course,
it's like the world of stamp collecting is a kind of cover for a fascist projected fascist coup, which they're sort of and the Mauritius Penny is a kind of code name for the man in charge of it, Lord Matterley.
It's so similar, and some of it's reused again in Robot, isn't it? Some of the ideas.
Yeah, Terence nicked the whole thing about. Well, he did co-write it, so he decided to take it. But yeah, there's a lot of similarities between this kind of fascist rally. So in the Avengers, it's Steed and Cathy Gale who turn up, and in the Robot, it's Tom Baker and Sarah Jane. I've lost. I kind of. So and to us in the Avengers, they got like. The Trojan Horse, where Riding Stables is a cover for a sort of assassination bureau, where people are being sort of bumped off in return for money, and the same with somebody. And also tries to sort of challenge, I think, at his work, some of the cliches. So in his Danger Man episode, parallel lines sometimes meet. John Drake, the John Drake character played by Patrick McGowan, teams up with the KGB colonel to sort of face a common enemy, and the same thing is sort of worked on again previously in his Avengers episode Concerto, where Steed turns up with his kind of KGB counterpart Zelenko, played excellently by the wonderful actor Nigel Stock. Again, sort of protect the Russian pianist from people who want to destroy the sort of détente that's evolving. So he sort of never falls into some of the kind of Cold War cliches, really.
Yeah, showing that there were people on the other side who are decent human beings as well. So it's
he's trying to say that, really.
Yeah,
and he sort of says that. And he wrote to his friend Gene Tate. He wrote to her saying, "Well, I sort of had all the baddies in the Avengers and Doctor Who were like capitalists or others, but nobody seems to have noticed."
Oh, that's fantastic.
There's often people saying often, well, Michael was a political writer, but I think that wasn't really. They're kind of, it's not like propaganda, it's not like agitprop. There are kind of subtle kind of anti-capitalist themes, but they're sort of fairly broad.
Yeah, it's an element of the story. It's not the central thrust, but it's there when you look for it.
No, it's not asking to side up to the Russian Revolution or take a position on what really happened in Kronstadt in 1921 or whatever, or happened Czechoslovakia in 1968 or so and so on.
Yeah.
So it's a fairly broad moral theme. Like at the end of, let's think, the debate of the dinosaurs, there's a debate about, when he and the Brigadier are held up by Captain Yates, and the Doctor is challenging him. There's often a common theme in many of his Doctor Who's, actually. There's a kind of central confrontation, like in Colony in Space between the Doctor and Dent, but in the Faceless Ones between the Doctor sort of goes up to confront the aliens on their satellite. In the Sea Devils and Silurians, he sort of confronts the leader of the Silurians and the Sea Devils to try and resolve things peacefully. And it's against, he's often sort of very critical of the Brigadier I think he says in the Silurian song about that's the typical of the army. They see a problem, they just want to kind of shoot at it. Or it's very much a kind of scene as someone who wants to try and bring people together and avoid conflict, although that often doesn't work out. But at least he tries.
Very much so, very much so. And it's very much that first scene where he meets the Silurian and the "Hello, are you a Silurian?" And it's just sort of it's the holding out the hand of friendship as well.
Yes, and how can I help you? And he's like, as the Silurian runs off, he's like saying, if you don't tell me what you want, you could end up, being destroyed or whatever.
Yeah.
Which had to be true, sadly.
So tell us a little bit more about where people can find your own work, because you do have your own content out there.
Oh yeah, so my other ego, alter ego, as an historian, is kind of looking into radical women in the 19th and 20th century, particularly at Manchester, which is near where I live. So I've got a website called Red Flag Walks, a WordPress site where some of my writings on radical women are available. I teach courses via Zoom once or twice a year, looking at the women in the 19th century, not just the suffragettes, but also women involved in Chartism, trade unions, many other campaigns, and also the 20th century, what happened after women got the vote, the campaigns to try and get equality in society, equal pay, which took a long time, till 75 to get, from being talked about for many years. So I'm looking at some of the women, like forgotten women often, like women who campaigned for peace, against fascism. Sylvia Pankhurst, for instance, after women got the vote, was very active in campaigns for women's rights, and also after 21 in the threat of fascism in Italy. Whereas lots of people, I have to say, seem quite happy with Mussolini and the way he's running Italy. She was pointing out to, well, this is a sort of a regime which is just got rid of freedom, is kidnapping and murdering its opponents, uses violence very readily. Try to alert people, particularly after Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, when Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, came to England and was living in Bath, I think it was, in exile. She became very friendly with him and campaigned for the rights of the Ethiopian people, so much so that Sylvia eventually went to live in Ethiopia and died there in 1960, I think it was. She's buried in Addis Ababa.
Wow. I had no idea. That's amazing. That's the sort of thing I need to get reading more carefully as to what you've got there.
Come on my course next time, Ken. It'd be good to have a few men on it, actually, because often men just need to think that women's history is for women, and there are about 90% women in the courses I do, which is disappointing. I'd like to think men would learn, but yeah, there you go. Still got a long way to go, really. But that's another discussion.
Absolutely. But Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat. It's been fascinating, and best of luck with the book. I'll be getting my copy ordered shortly.
Thank you. Thanks, Kay.
There we go. Thank you so much to Michael. And as we said, things are not always what they seem. The Writing and Politics of Malcolm Hulke by Michael Herbert is available to buy from lulu.com. That's lulu.com. And you can find more about Michael online at his blog, which is redflagwalks.wordpress.com. That's redflagwalks.wordpress.com. He also has an online SF blog, Fantasies of Possibility, which you can find, and you can find him as MJ Herbert on Blue Sky. So it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for. We do like to play out with a track, and we're going to go with one today which maybe Mac would approve of. This one comes from the soundtrack to the film Battleship Potemkin, which was created by Pet Shop Boys, and this song is called For Freedom. And I think it sort of sums up communism and togetherness, and probably in a way that Mac would probably approve of. So, until next time, I've been Kenny Smith. This has been The Power of Three.